Welcome to the Word. We are in Exodus chapter 2 again, part 2. Let's get to the text. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people, and he looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He said, "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come home so soon today?" And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with the man. And he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." During those many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. The grass withers and the flowers fade, but the word of our Lord stands forever. Thanks be to God. So let's go through this line by line, picking up in verse 11 where we left off. Moses is now grown. The New Testament is going to tell us that Moses is now 40 years old. He has been raised in Egyptian culture. He has learned the ways of the Egyptians, but he does know that he is a Hebrew. He has memories as a child, very likely from being a Hebrew. He speaks both languages, very likely, almost certainly. And yet he goes out. He went out to his people. He does not see himself as an Egyptian. The New Testament tells us that he kind of scorns that, but instead identifies with his people. And he looks on their burdens. He notices that they are weighed down. And he sees one Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. And he looks this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He saw a social or societal injustice, and he took matters into his own hands, and he murders. I am curious how much this incident then weighs on Moses later in his life, particularly as he is writing the law, when he sees that this crime that God very much lets him get away with, it's not that as though he doesn't get away with it before God, but he survives it. He survives the injustice of Pharaoh would have had every right to put him to death. He just went and murdered one of the taskmasters. Now that taskmaster was also in the wrong, but I can just imagine this being a big part of Moses' own thinking as he goes and writes the laws on thou shalt not murder, and he gets into the details of it in later chapters after Exodus 20. But he looks this way and that, and he kills this guy and hides him in the sand. And the next day, he goes out again. He keeps going out to his people, and he sees 2 Hebrews that are struggling with each other, and he tries to intervene. He says, "Why do you strike your companion?" And the guy that was striking his companion said, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" So when it's an Egyptian beating up a Hebrew, Moses commits murder. Now when it's a Hebrew beating up a Hebrew, he tries to be an arbiter, and this guy goes, "You're going to kill me too?" There's something inconsistent in Moses here, and Moses, when being confronted with this fact, realizes, oh no, it's gotten out that I am a murderer. And then the text tells us, Pharaoh hears of it, and he seeks to kill Moses. The idea of Moses being kind of buddy-buddy with the new and upcoming Pharaoh and being kind of a son to the Pharaoh, it might be in the movie The Prince of Egypt, which is overwhelmingly well done. Does not seem to be accurate here at all. It's putting a lot between the lines that we do not know in the text. So Moses has to flee from Pharaoh, and he flees into the wilderness of Sinai to the land of Midian, and most people don't know the descendants of Abraham. Abraham, after Sarah dies, has other wives and other children, and one of those children is named Midian, or a name that kind of in Hebrew sounds like Midian, and that's where the Midianite people come from. God in his providence, Moses flees, and he finds some of kind of his own distant relatives. How much does Moses know of that at the time? I don't know. But he sits down by a well. Wells are where you meet people. Wells are where the society gathers around. Where there isn't water, there isn't society. Where there is water, there will be society in the ancient, particularly the arid world. He sits down by a well. And then it tells us that there is a priest in Midian. And it doesn't tell us a priest of who. But there's a priest of Midian, and he has a whole bunch of daughters, 7 daughters, and they are shepherdesses. Now, this is not unusual in the ancient Near East. Daughters would often work as shepherds fairly late into their teenage years. They would do that in Israel as well. But the older male shepherds are not nice to them. The shepherds drive them away, so the girls have to always wait for the men to go first. And Moses stands up and saves them, and he waters their flock. This is a much better side of Moses as opposed to just murdering someone. But we do see, we get a sense of Moses's desire here, that he is a man of action. He is a man who is willing to intervene. He has come into a town that he does not know, and he sees men beating up on some young girls, or at least not fighting them off or pushing them off, threatening them, who knows how. So, and Moses sees this is wrong, and he wants to intervene. And so the gals go home, and they're home much earlier than they usually are. And their father says, "How is it that you have come home so early?" He's surprised. Usually it takes a long time. They have to wait for the men, apparently. And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and even drew water for us and watered the flock." Now, why do they call him an Egyptian? All we can do is guess at this point. Maybe the clothing that he is in is Egyptian. Maybe because he was raised in Pharaoh's house, he would shave himself. And shaving, the Egyptians were almost hyper conscious of cleanliness. They would shave regularly, daily, whereas the Hebrews were not. So maybe it's his accent. We don't know. But they identify him as an Egyptian that stepped in to take care of them. And this priest says to his daughters, "Where is he? Let's bring him in. Let's feed him." And Moses is content to dwell there. This man is now 40 years old, the New Testament tells us. He has fled for his life. He is a murderer. Though he is born and raised a Hebrew and he identifies with them, he's also been raised an Egyptian in Pharaoh's court. He's been trained in the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he's lost all of it and had to flee for his life at about 40 years old. And he gets married and he starts having children, one of whom he names Gershom. He'll also have a second son during his time here. But then Moses, writing this book, Moses is the author of Exodus. If you believe Jesus in the New Testament, Jesus sees Moses as the author of the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, otherwise known as the Pentateuch or the Torah. So Moses is the writer of this book, but and he is being inspired by the Holy Spirit. He is being carried along in that, but also just as a piece of literature, it kind of breaks in, and as opposed to following just the story of Moses, it pauses and kind of gives you a little narrative from the perspective of God. And it says, "During those many days, the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, dies. And the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. So clearly, they're being oppressed, the killing of their children, being harsh labor being forced upon them is continuing. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, up to God. We need to talk about this. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant. God remembers his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. God knew. Now, we could read this and immediately be encouraged by it, and we should. We should see that God is a God that remembers his promises. And when God, particularly when God makes a covenant promise, it always includes the descendants. That is the difference between God just simply making a promise and God making a covenant. Legally, if I make a promise to you, let's say I owe you, I promise to give you $100, and I die, then you're not going to get those $100. But covenant promises are a sort of promise, a type of legal commitment that automatically includes our children. If I enter into a covenant obligations regarding my land legally here in the United States, and I die and my children inherit that land, those covenant obligations and blessings all fall on my children. That what covenant means inherently is that it includes the children. Now, they might not keep covenant, they might become covenant breakers, but children are always included in the covenant. And God remembers his people, but it's not just a generic remembering. Moses is pointing out this is a covenant remembrance. And he hears their sorrow. He hears their cries for help. He hears their prayers. Sometimes there is this idea that the Israelites, when they go into Egypt, become very syncretistic. They start practicing polytheism. The testimony of Exodus says none of that. None of that. There's a few things that'll go on in a little bit later in Exodus that we'll deal with then. But so far, the midwives are being faithful. The New Testament is going to call Moses a person of faith. Yocheved is a woman of faith who's protecting her son, defying Pharaoh. And God's people are crying out to him. And God hears them. So God's people are faithful. Whatever that looks like, the details of that we might not know, but God's people are being faithful, and God hears them and remembers them. And this is our God, a God that remembers. Now, how is it that prayers go up? How is it that God can know all things and still remember something? How is it that it comes to mind? How can God set out on a certain course of action, and then the Old Testament will use language of God repenting or relenting from a disaster that comes? And if you're thinking that is an excellent question that we're not going to get into today, but maybe in another episode. But we can be comforted knowing that God hears the prayers of his people. He hears the groans of his people. And his remembrance of his people is a remembrance based on covenant, his covenant promises, that God is faithful. God is faithful, even when man is not. Let God be found true, though every man a liar. Therein is our comfort as believers. Thanks for staying for another episode of Welcome to the Word, Exodus chapter 2. Go in peace.